For those of you who do not follow me on Twitter, over the weekend I decided to conduct my first mass fantasy poll with my audience. I decided to throw in plenty of hashtags, try and reach outside my own bubble as much as possible, and find out who exactly is currently the most popular fantasy author. This was quite fun. Thousands of votes were cast, many hearts were broken, and the results might surprise some. So I decided to pull together many authors. Twitter limits you to 4 possible voting choices per bracket, so every day I had to put out mini brackets. And the first day, obviously, we had the most. Many fantasy authors were chosen. And let's go over the contestants right now. We had Patrick Rothfuss, Brandon Sanderson, George R.R. Martin, and Neil Gaiman making up the first bracket. In the second bracket, we had Tolkien, Jordan, Pratchett, and Rowling, some of the most iconic names in all of fantasy. In the third bracket, we had Eddings, Abercrombie, Le Guin, and Weeks, all very respectable names within fantasy. In the fourth bracket, we had Hobb, Brooks, Jimson, and Sapkowski. Really heavy hitters here, and some of the more outside the norm for fantasy coming through strong in this one. And in the second to last bracket of the first day, we had some of the oddballs of fantasy. Scott Lynch, the true master of mischievous characters. Stephen King, the creator of the disturbing King multiverse. Erikson, the crafter of Malazan, Book of the Fallen, the largest fantasy universe arguably ever made. And Jim Butcher, a man who caused millions of fans to fall in love with his dashing, mischievous Harry Dresden within the Dresden Files. And in the last bracket of the day, we had Lawrence, Goodkind, Feist, and Salvatore. Really just a mishmash of great and terrible and Goodkind for this one. This was the first day. Many votes were cast, but each bracket did have distinct winners. The top 2 from each bracket would move on to the next day. I decided this to keep it in fair fights for those brackets that were too much so skewed to one side. So the top 2 always moved on. In the first bracket of Rothfuss, Sanderson, Martin, and Gaiman, Sanderson completely and utterly stomped, walking away with 66% of the vote. Martin did come in second with a respectable 18. Gaiman tried his best with 10, not bad, and Rothfuss unfortunately did come in last with 6% of the vote. It looks like Sanderson and Martin move on to the next day. We did get some good commentary in the comments for this one. Alison Sedai expressed her feelings of Brandon Sanderson as such. Sanderson is not perfect, far from it, but his Cosmere verse literally had me binging every single book within it and left me wanting more. It inspired my imagination so awesomely. I gotta vote for him. And then we had the wonderful commentary, this, which yes, I agree, this. For the second bracket of Tolkien, Jordan, Pratchett, and Rowling, we had the comment from Seize the Memes of Production, this one is evil! It is a bit evil. We're putting some of the most heavy-hitting beloved names against each other early on, causing controversy, forcing you to choose. Who do you love most, and who were you willing to let die? Well, the people spoke, and Tolkien and Jordan came out on top, with Tolkien stealing 51% of the vote, and Jordan walking away with a very respectable 35%. Pratchett and Rowling suffered from starvation, only walking away with 8% and 6% respectively. And the next round of Eddings, Abercrombie, Le Guin, and Weeks, we had Angry Trevor coming through expressing his feelings on the matter, saying, I will fight anyone who does not say Eddings. I'm very sorry, Angry Trevor, but came in last with 11% of the vote. Up next, we had Le Guin with 20, but the two winners, the two who walked away with pride, were Brent Weeks with 24% of the vote and Joe Abercrombie with a very respectable 45% of the vote. A contentious round to be sure, with 395 votes cast. This was fairly close across the board. In the next bracket of the day, blood was shed, as I forced you to choose between Hobb, Brooks, Jimson, and Sapkowski. Well, the closest by far of the entire tournament happened here. Between the 328 votes cast, Hobb walked away with 34% of the vote. Subkowski walked away with 34% of the vote. A true tie, two champions unable to decide who is more loved. Brooks and Jimson had 17 and 15, a respectable showing, but not enough to move on. In the next bracket, we had Scott Lynch, Stephen King, Erickson, and Butcher. King was able to pull away with the victory here, but not by much. Between the 467 votes cast, he walked away with only 37%. Erickson and Scott Lynch fought nobly, but Lynch walked away on top. The Epic of Malazan, Book of the Fallen, may be one of the most impressive showings in all of fantasy, but its lack of mass appeal seems to be undercut by Gentleman Bastard's charm, and Scott Lynch moved on. Jim Butcher did fine with 14%, but Lynch moves on with 25%, and Erickson suffers with a very close 23%. A dark day for Malazan fans across the world. In the final bracket of day one, as the sun set on the first day of bloodshed of the Fantasy Author Tournament, Lawrence, Goodkind, Feist, and Salvatore. Feist actually came in last, one of the true legends of fantasy, whose name seems to be losing its strength. Between the 307 votes cast, Feist only got 15%, losing out to Goodkind at 16% of the vote. Salvatore, at a decent step up of 32%, will move on to the next round, and the champion of the final bracket of day one was Lawrence with 37% of the vote. Good on you, Lawrence. A bloody day indeed for fantasy authors. But now we must bury the dead and move on to day two. Day two was quite the endeavor. We had controversy. Election interference occurred. That's right, it's real, and it even occurred within the first bracket of the day. We had George R.R. Martin going up against Scott Lynch, Stephen King, and Brandon Sanderson. I know what you're thinking. Brandon and Martin were already in a bracket together. We know who will win here. But you know nothing. Between the 965 votes cast, Lynch, while giving a noble showing in the first round of the tournament, lost with only 4% of the vote. Stephen King only managed to walk away with 6% of the votes. Brandon Sanderson walked away with 40. But I know what you're thinking. There's still 50% left. How could someone who lost to Brandon before, George R.R. Martin, now walk away with a larger percent of the vote? Well, election interference occurred. Ideas of Ice and Fire, one of the largest Game of Thrones YouTubers on the platform, or should I say, a Song of Ice and Fire YouTubers, commented on the tweet, telling his fans, vote for George R.R. Martin. Hundreds of votes pour in. Martin goes from being almost in last place to stealing the first place spot. Well, I must honor the results of the vote. Martin walks away the victor of bracket 1 of day 2. But as still the top 4 from day 2 move on, him and Brandon, with so many votes cast for them, both move on to the final day of the Fantasy Author Tournament. In the second bracket, Tolkien, Hobb, Subkowski, and Lawrence. This was a bloody bracket indeed. Hobb, Subkowski, and Lawrence all did their best, but they were going up against the Grandfather. Tolkien came away with the largest stomp of the entire tournament. With 80% of the vote, Hobb, Subkowski, and Lawrence had to divide up a remaining 20. Hobb received 9, Subkowski 8, and Lawrence 4%. Tolkien is the clear victor and is the only one from bracket 2 to move on, with all of the other contestants failing to even breach 10%. In bracket 3, we had another fairly large stomp. Robert Jordan, Joe Abercrombie, Brent Weeks, and R.A. Salvatore, with 560 votes cast. Salvatore walked away with 6%. Brent Weeks, a noble 9%. Joe Abercrombie, a competitive 18%. But Jordan officially stomped as well, with 68% of the vote and earning a spot in the final day of the bracket. So now we have our final contestants. Robert Jordan, J.R.R. Tolkien, Brandon Sanderson, and George R.R. Martin. It's time for the final day of the tournament. Election interference occurred once again, trying to sway the vote for Martin from Ideas of Ice and Fire. But was it enough? Let's look. Coming in last place of the final day of the Fantasy Author Tournament, Robert Jordan walked away with 20% of the vote. Coming in second to last, J.R.R. Tolkien walked away with only 21% of the vote. In second place, George R.R. Martin walked away with 27% of the vote. And sealing his place as currently the most popular fantasy author in the world, Brandon Sanderson walked away with 32% of the vote. Between these four, they divided up 1,298 votes. And Brandon is the winner. Emotions were hurt. Comments came flooding in. GeekCritique came through and said, at long last, the grandfather of fantasy has been dethroned. A great YouTuber. Check out his channel, link down below. The Legendarium podcast, a wonderful podcast, also linked down below, as well as Ideas of Ice and Fire, came in and said, 74% of your followers are savages. Michelle responded, why must you hurt me in this way? Referencing the tough choice. It was a very tough choice. I Killed Osmodian said he was disgusted with 80% of those who voted, seeing how Robert Jordan came in last. Brandon Sanderson, with a poll kind of half-heartedly conducted over a weekend, is the undisputed champion of fantasy. Congratulations, Brandon. If you would like your trophy, I don't have one. Thank you for indulging me in this fantasy tournament. That was a ton of fun to conduct over the weekend. Thank you everyone who voted. If you'd like to vote in the next one, please go right ahead and follow me on Twitter. I'm not sure which poll I will do next, but it'll be fun nonetheless. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace. And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high tier Patreon. Definitely not Odin. Oidian. You put some accents in there. Pretty sure it's supposed to be definitely not Odin. I have a sneaking suspicion you may or may not be Odin. I'm not entirely sure, but your name is so long you get your own row on Patreon list. So enjoy that. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.